The sound of gunshots echoed through the dusty streets of Val Verde, Texas, as Madeline Lewis clutched her skirts and ran faster than she'd ever run before. It was 1875, and she hadn't expected her first day in this frontier town to involve fleeing for her life. Behind her, 3 men pursued on horseback, their intentions as clear as the cloudless sky above. They wanted the deed in her satchel, the only thing of value she had left after her father's death, and they were willing to kill for it. Madeline's breath came in ragged gasps as she veered off the main street, ducking between buildings and racing toward the outskirts of town. Her honey-blonde hair had come loose from its pins, streaming behind her like a flag in the wind. At 22, she was no stranger to hardship, but this was different. This was terror in its purest form. "Get back here, girl," one of the men shouted. "That land belongs to Mr. Harrington," but it didn't. It belonged to her father and now to her. The deed was legal and binding, no matter what the wealthy rancher Franklin Harrington claimed. The flat terrain beyond town gave way to scattered mesquite trees and gullies. Madeline spotted what looked like a path through the brush and took it, hoping to lose her pursuers. Her boots slipped on loose soil as she descended into a shallow ravine. The sound of hoofbeats grew fainter. Had she lost them? Madeline slowed her pace, trying to quiet her breathing as she listened. The silence gave her hope. She continued moving, picking her way carefully along the ravine floor. That's when the ground beneath her feet changed. What had been firm sand suddenly gave way like butter on a hot day. Her right foot sank several inches before she could react. "What on earth?" she gasped, trying to pull her foot free. Instead of releasing, the ground seemed to pull back, drawing her deeper. With horror, she realized what it was: quicksand. Madeline had heard about it from her father's stories, but had never encountered it herself. Panic surged through her as she tried to remain calm, remembering fragments of advice. Don't struggle, try to lie flat. But how could she do that when her feet were already trapped knee-deep? "Help," she called out, immediately regretting it. What if the men heard her? But what choice did she have? Already the sand had claimed her to mid-thigh, and she could feel its inexorable pull. The more she tried to free herself, the faster she sank. The quicksand was now at her waist, the pressure around her body increasing with each passing moment. Tears sprang to her eyes as desperation set in. "Somebody help me, please," her voice echoed across the empty landscape. In the distance, a cloud of dust rose from the horizon. Another rider. Friend or foe, she couldn't tell, but it was her only hope. "Over here," she screamed, waving her arms frantically. The movement caused her to sink another inch. The rider approached at a gallop, and Madeline could make out a tall figure atop a powerful chestnut stallion. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but as he drew nearer, she could see piercing blue eyes surveying the situation with calm precision. Without a word, the cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping a safe distance from the quicksand's edge. He uncoiled a rope from his saddle with practiced ease. "Stay still, madam," he called, his voice deep and steady. "I'm going to throw this to you. Catch it and wrap it around your chest, under your arms." Madeline nodded, fighting to keep her composure as the sand reached her ribcage. The cowboy swung the lasso in a wide arc before sending it flying toward her. It fell short on the first try. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, the reality of her situation becoming more terrifying with each passing second. "Don't you worry," he replied, gathering the rope. "We've got time." But they both knew that wasn't true. The quicksand had her in its relentless grip, and it was pulling her deeper with each breath. The cowboy threw again, and this time the loop sailed perfectly over her head. Madeline grabbed it with trembling hands and managed to secure it under her arms as instructed. "Good," he said. "Now I'm going to pull. Try to lean back slightly if you can. It'll help bring your legs up." He wrapped the other end of the rope around his saddle horn and began to lead his horse backward, slowly applying tension to the line. The rope tightened around Madeline's chest, digging into her skin through her dress. She bit her lip to keep from crying out in pain. For a moment, nothing happened. The sand held fast to its prize. Then, gradually, she felt her body begin to shift. With agonizing slowness, she was being pulled from the quicksand's deadly embrace. "That's it," the cowboy encouraged. "You're doing fine." With one final, powerful pull, Madeline's body broke free from the sucking mud with a wet sound. She slid across the firmer ground toward her rescuer, covered in thick, gray muck but gloriously alive. The cowboy secured his horse and hurried to her side, kneeling beside her with concern etched on his sun-bronzed face. For the first time, Madeline got a clear look at him. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and those remarkable blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, helping her to sit up. "No, Her words were cut short by the sound of approaching riders. The men who had been chasing her had found them. The cowboy's hand moved to the revolver at his hip. "Friends of yours?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "They want to kill me for my land deed," Madeline whispered, clutching her satchel which, miraculously, had remained with her through the ordeal. Without hesitation, the cowboy helped her to her feet. "Can you ride?" Madeline nodded, though her legs felt like water beneath her. In one swift movement, he lifted her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. "Hold tight," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. As the three men crested the ridge, the cowboy spurred his horse into motion. The powerful animal responded instantly, carrying them away from danger at a thundering gallop. "My name's Daniel Keller," the cowboy said as they rode, "and I reckon you've got quite a story to tell, Miss Lewis," she replied, her voice shaking with exhaustion and fading adrenaline. "Madeline Lewis." "Well, Miss Lewis," Daniel said, guiding his horse toward a small cabin barely visible in the distance, "let's get you somewhere safe. Then you can tell me why those men are so keen on your property." As they rode, Madeline found herself oddly aware of the strong arms that encircled her to hold the reins, the solid chest at her back. Despite the danger, despite the fear that still coursed through her veins, she felt a strange sense of security she hadn't experienced since her father was alive. What she didn't know then was that this chance encounter, her life saved by a cowboy's rope, would change everything. The story that was about to unfold would be filled with danger, betrayal, and a love that neither of them was looking for, but both would fight to keep. Daniel's cabin was modest but sturdy, set back against a rocky hillside with a clear view of the surrounding countryside. A small corral stood adjacent to the main structure, currently empty save for a dappled gray mare that nickered at their approach. "My place isn't much," Daniel said as he helped Madeline dismount, "but it's defensible and hard to find if you don't know it's here." Madeline's legs nearly buckled beneath her when her feet touched the ground. The quicksand ordeal and subsequent escape had drained what little strength she had left. Daniel caught her elbow, steadying her with a gentle but firm grip. "Easy now," he murmured. "You've been through quite an ordeal." She nodded, embarrassed by her weakness but grateful for his support. "Thank you, Mr. Keller. I don't know how I can ever repay you for saving my life." Daniel's expression remained serious as he led her toward the cabin. "No need for thanks, Miss Lewis. Couldn't leave you to that fate." He paused, his eyes scanning the horizon before returning to her mud-caked form. "But I am curious about what brought a lady like yourself to these parts, and why men are chasing you with guns drawn." Inside, The cabin was surprisingly neat. A table and 2 chairs occupied one corner, a cast iron stove another. A narrow bed with a handmade quilt stood against the far wall, and various supplies were organized on shelves. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and orderly. "Sit," Daniel instructed, pulling out a chair. "I'll fetch some water so you can clean up a bit." While he stepped outside to the pump, Madeline sank into the offered chair, her mind racing. She had never been alone with a man who wasn't family, let alone in his home. Propriety dictated she should be scandalized, but circumstances had hardly left room for social niceties. Daniel returned with a bucket of water and placed it beside her along with a clean cloth. "I'll step outside while you wash up," he said. "I've got some clothes you can borrow, just an old shirt and trousers. They'll be too big, but they're clean, which is more than can be said for what you're wearing now." Madeline glanced down at her once fine dress, now ruined beyond repair by mud and sand. "Thank you," she said softly. Once alone, she quickly removed her outer garments and used the cool water to wash away the grime from her face, neck, and arms. The clothes Daniel had left were indeed oversized, but she managed to make them serviceable by rolling up the sleeves and pants legs and cinching the waist with a length of rope he'd provided. When she called him back in, Daniel's eyes widened briefly before he schooled his features back to neutrality. "Now," he said, setting a pot of coffee to heat on the stove, "suppose you tell me what's going on." Madeline took a deep breath and began her story. She told him about her father, Thomas Lewis, a lawyer from St. Louis who had acquired land in Texas as payment from a client years ago. When he died unexpectedly of pneumonia 3 months earlier, Madeline discovered they were nearly destitute. Her father had been too generous with clients who couldn't pay, too trusting with business partners who took advantage. All that remained was the deed to this Texas property. "I sold what little we had left in St. Louis and used the money to travel here," she explained. "I thought I could sell the land and use the proceeds to establish myself somewhere, perhaps as a schoolteacher." Daniel listened attentively, pouring coffee for them both when it was ready. "And where exactly is this land?" "According to the deed, it's about 15 miles northwest of Val Verde, nearly 800 acres. Daniel's cup paused halfway to his lips. 800 acres in that area, that would include Cottonwood Creek. He set his cup down slowly. "Miss Lewis, if that's true, your land controls the main water source for half the county." Madeline nodded. "That's what Mr. Harrington said when I visited his office this morning. He offered to buy it, but the price was insultingly low. When I declined, his demeanor changed." "Franklin Harrington," Daniel said, his voice hardening. "The man believes he owns Val Verde and near enough does. He's not used to being refused. I gathered that when his men started shooting at me." Daniel's jaw tightened. Those weren't just his men. The one in the black coat was Sheriff Moss. He's Harrington's puppet, has been for years. A cold dread settled in Madeline's stomach. The sheriff. Then there's truly nowhere safe for me in town. "Not at present," Daniel agreed. "Harrington won't stop until he has that deed. Water rights in this county are worth killing for, especially with the drought we've had these past 2 years. What am I to do? I can't sell to him, not just because his offer was unfair, but because he's tried to have me killed." Madeline's voice rose with indignation and fear. Daniel studied her for a long moment, those piercing blue eyes seeming to look right through her. "You have options, Miss Lewis, though none are without risk. You could try to sell quickly to someone else, though Harrington would likely interfere. You could file a complaint with the federal marshal next time he passes through, but that could be weeks away. Or," Madeline prompted, sensing he had another suggestion, "or you could stay here where it's safe, while I help you figure out exactly what you're dealing with." He held up a hand when she began to protest. "I know it's not proper, but neither is being shot in the street by a corrupt sheriff." Madeline closed her eyes briefly, weighing her limited choices. When she opened them, her decision was made. "If you're certain it's not an imposition, Mr. Keller, I would be grateful for your assistance and protection, but I insist on compensating you for your trouble." Daniel shook his head. "No need for that. I've got my reasons for wanting to see Harrington taken down a peg or two." "Personal reasons?" she asked, curious about this solitary cowboy who had saved her life and now offered his protection. A shadow passed across his features. "You could say that." He stood abruptly, ending the conversation. "You should rest. Take the bed, I'll make a pallet by the door." Before she could protest this arrangement, Daniel had gathered some blankets and stepped outside, presumably to check on the horses and secure the perimeter of his property. Left alone, Madeline crossed to the small window and looked out at the rugged landscape. The sun was beginning to set, painting the hills with gold and crimson. It was beautiful in its wild way, nothing like the orderly streets of St. Louis. She thought of her father, wondering what he would advise her to do in this situation. Thomas Lewis had been a man of principle, often to his detriment when it came to financial matters, but he had also been practical. "Sometimes, Maddie," he would say, "the right path isn't the easiest one, but it's the one you can live with when you look in the mirror each morning." Could she live with selling her land to a man like Harrington, knowing he would use its water to control others? No, she decided. Her father wouldn't have done that, and neither would she. Daniel returned as darkness fell, carrying additional firewood. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to handling himself in difficult situations. Madeline found herself wondering about his story, what had brought him to this isolated cabin, and what history he shared with Franklin Harrington. As if sensing her thoughts, Daniel glanced up from stoking the fire. "You should know," he said quietly, "that helping you puts you at risk by association. I'm not exactly in Harrington's good graces." "May I ask why?" Daniel was silent for so long that Madeline thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "3 years ago, I worked for Harrington's outfit. I was his foreman, actually. Then came the drought. Smaller ranchers started losing cattle because Harrington had dammed up sections of the creek that ran through his property, the same creek that flows through your land upstream. When people complained, accidents started happening." His hands stilled on the poker. "A good friend of mine, Joe Fletcher, confronted Harrington publicly about it. A week later, Joe was found hanged. They called it suicide, but Joe had just gotten engaged. He wasn't the type." "You think Mr. Harrington had him killed?" Madeline whispered, horrified. Daniel nodded grimly. "I know it, but proving it was another matter. I tried to gather evidence and Harrington found out. There was an ambush. I took a bullet in the shoulder but managed to escape. Been living out here ever since, doing odd jobs for the smaller ranchers who'll still hire me despite Harrington's blacklisting." The firelight cast dramatic shadows across his face, highlighting the determination in his eyes. This wasn't just about helping her, Madeline realized. It was about justice delayed. "I'm sorry about your friend," she said softly, "and I'm sorry my troubles have revived yours." Daniel's expression softened slightly. "Don't be. Perhaps it's time someone stood up to Harrington and won. Get some sleep, Miss Lewis. Tomorrow we'll ride out to your property and see exactly what we're dealing with." Despite her exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily to Madeline. The events of the day replayed in her mind: the confrontation with Harrington, the chase, the terrifying moments in the quicksand, and her rescue by this enigmatic cowboy. She could still feel the pressure of the sand around her body, still hear the sound of Daniel's voice cutting through her panic. In the darkness, She listened to his steady breathing from across the room. A stranger who had risked his life to save hers, and now offered to risk it again to help her protect what was rightfully hers. In the rational part of her mind, Madeline knew she should be more cautious about trusting him so completely. But in her heart, she felt a certainty she couldn't explain. Daniel Keller was a good man, and tomorrow they would begin to face whatever challenges awaited them together. Dawn broke with a symphony of bird calls and the distant lowing of cattle. Madeline awoke feeling surprisingly refreshed, despite the unfamiliar surroundings and the lingering soreness from her quicksand ordeal. She found Daniel already up, cooking breakfast over the stove. "Hope you don't mind beans and bacon," he said by way of greeting. "It's not fancy, but it'll keep you going." "It smells wonderful," she replied truthfully, her stomach reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the previous morning. They ate in comfortable silence, and Madeline found herself studying her host when he wasn't looking. In the soft morning light, Daniel Keller appeared less intimidating than he had the day before. Yes, there was still that hardness around his eyes that spoke of difficult experiences, but there was also a gentleness in how he handled things, passing her a cup, tending the fire, caring for his horses. After breakfast, Daniel brought her some clean water and stepped outside to give her privacy while she washed up and did what she could with her appearance. Her hair, freed from its pins during her flight, was a tangled mess that took considerable effort to comb out with her fingers. Eventually, she managed to braid it and secure it with a bit of string Daniel had provided. When she emerged from the cabin, she found him saddling both horses. "I thought we might take a roundabout approach to your property," he explained. "Best not to use the main roads where Harrington's men might be watching." Madeline nodded, eyeing the gray mare with some trepidation. "I should warn you that my riding experience is limited to occasional pleasure rides in the city park." Daniel's lips quirked up at one corner, not quite a smile, but close. "Daisy here is gentle as they come. She'll follow Rusty's lead without any fuss." He helped her mount, his hand strong and sure at her waist. The borrowed trousers made straddling the saddle much easier than it would have been in skirts, though Madeline still blushed at the impropriety of her attire. As if reading her thoughts, Daniel said, "Once we get a better handle on the situation, we can see about getting you some proper clothes from town. But for now, those will have to do." They rode for nearly 2 hours, Daniel leading them through a series of gullies and rocky passes that kept them largely hidden from view. He pointed out landmarks as they went: a distinctive rock formation, a stand of cottonwoods, a distant butte, helping Madeline orient herself in this unfamiliar landscape. "Your property begins just over that ridge," he finally said, pointing to a gentle rise ahead. "That's Cottonwood Creek running along the base. Even in drought years, it flows steady because it's fed by underground springs." As they crested the ridge, Madeline drew in a breath of surprise. Below them stretched a valley of surprising beauty. The creek Daniel had mentioned wound like a silver ribbon through the center, bordered by the cottonwoods that gave it its name. The land rose gently on either side, offering a mix of grassy plains perfect for grazing and rocky outcroppings that added character to the vista. "It's beautiful," she whispered, understanding for the first time why her father had accepted this land as payment. It wasn't just valuable, it was magnificent in its wild way. Daniel nodded. 800 acres of prime Texas rangeland with its own water source. "In these parts, that's as good as gold." They rode down into the valley, following the creek upstream. Daniel pointed out the natural features that made the land so valuable: not just the water, but the sheltered areas that would protect cattle during storms, the diverse vegetation that would provide year-round grazing, and the defensible positions that would be important to any rancher concerned about rustlers or other threats. "Your father chose well," he remarked as they paused to let the horses drink from the creek. "Land like this would normally be snapped up by someone like Harrington before an outsider could even hear it was available." "It wasn't a choice, really," Madeline explained. "A client couldn't pay his legal fees, so he offered this land instead. My father accepted because the man had a family to support and no other way to pay." Daniel studied her thoughtfully. "Your father sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Madeline confirmed, a pang of grief tightening her chest. "The best of men, just not the most practical when it came to financial matters." They continued their exploration, eventually coming to an area where the creek narrowed between rocky banks. Daniel dismounted and helped Madeline down, then led her to a spot where they could see downstream. "This is the strategic point," he explained, pointing to the natural constriction in the creek. "From here, you could control the water flow to everything downstream, which includes Harrington's main ranch and about a dozen smaller operations." Madeline frowned. "I would never dam the creek like Harrington did." "I believe you," Daniel said. "But Harrington can't risk someone else having that power over him. That's why he wants your land so badly." As they stood side by side, surveying the property, Madeline felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride in owning something so beautiful and valuable, fear of the man who wanted to take it from her, and a growing sense of determination to find a solution that would honor her father's memory. "There's an old line shack near the northern boundary," Daniel said, interrupting her thoughts. "It's not much, but it's solid. Might be a good place to stay while we figure things out. More defensible than my cabin if Harrington's men come looking." "We?" Madeline asked, surprised by his continued use of the plural. Daniel met her gaze directly. "Unless you'd rather I leave you to handle this alone." "No," she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I'm grateful for your help, Mr. Keller. I just don't want to impose on your kindness indefinitely." Something in his expression softened. "Daniel," he said, "if we're going to be working together, you might as well call me Daniel." "Daniel," she repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate on her tongue. "And you must call me Madeline." He nodded, his eyes lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary before he turned back to the horses. "Let's check out that line shack. If it's in decent shape, we can bring supplies from my cabin tomorrow." The line shack proved to be small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot. A layer of dust covered everything, but the roof was intact and the windows were unbroken. "This will do nicely," Madeline decided after they'd inspected it thoroughly. "A good cleaning, some provisions, and it will be quite habitable." Daniel looked dubious. "It's pretty basic living for a city lady." "I'm not as delicate as I appear, Mr. Daniel," Madeline corrected herself. "And needs must when the devil drives, as my father would say." That earned her a genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him appear years younger. Madeline felt an unexpected flutter in her chest at the sight. "We should head back," Daniel said, glancing at the sun's position. "We've got enough daylight to reach my cabin before dark if we leave now." As they rode back through the valley, taking a different route than before, Madeline's mind was busy with plans. "What if I offered to sell Harrington just the water rights?" she suggested. "Not the land itself, but guaranteed access to the creek." Daniel considered this. "It might work, if he believed you'd honor the agreement. But Harrington isn't known for compromising when he can take what he wants by force." "There must be a way to resolve this without violence," Madeline insisted. "I'm not willing to sell to him after what he's done, but neither do I want a war." "Sometimes," Daniel said quietly, War finds you whether you want it or not. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. "Tell me about yourself," Madeline said suddenly, wanting to break the somber mood. "How did you come to be a cowboy in Texas?" Daniel seemed surprised by the question, but after a moment, he began to speak. He told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, learning to ride almost before he could walk. About losing his parents to influenza when he was 17 and heading west to find his own way in the world. About working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, about the friends he'd made and lost, about finally settling in Val Verde when he was offered the foreman position at Harrington's ranch. "I thought I'd finally found a place to put down roots," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "But once I saw who Harrington really was, I couldn't stay, couldn't be part of what he was doing to people." "It took courage to stand against him," Madeline observed. Daniel shrugged. "Or foolishness. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." "My father always said that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than fear." Daniel glanced at her, an unreadable expression in his eyes. "Your father sounds like he was as wise as he was kind." "He would have liked you," Madeline said with certainty, though she wasn't sure why she felt so confident of this. When they arrived back at Daniel's cabin, the sun was just touching the horizon. While Daniel tended to the horses, Madeline took it upon herself to prepare a simple meal from the provisions she found in his cupboards. "You didn't have to cook," Daniel said when he came inside to find her stirring a pot of beans with added bacon and some wild onions she'd found in his garden. "I wanted to," she replied. "It seems only fair, given all you're doing for me." They ate by lantern light, the conversation flowing more easily than it had the night before. Daniel asked about her life in St. Louis, and Madeline found herself sharing stories of her childhood, of her father's legal practice, of the books she loved to read. "I always wanted to be a teacher," she confessed. "I even started training at the normal school in St. Louis, but had to leave when my father fell ill. I was hoping to use the proceeds from selling this land to finish my education." "You still can," Daniel said, "once we resolve this situation with Harrington." "Perhaps," Madeline agreed, though she was beginning to wonder if selling the land was what she truly wanted. There was something about this place, this wild, beautiful country that called to something deep within her. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Daniel broached the subject they'd been avoiding. "Tomorrow, we should prepare the line shack, but we also need to think about how to handle Harrington. He won't give up easily, and the longer we wait, the more time he has to plan his next move." Madeline stared into the flames, considering their options. "What if we appealed directly to the other ranchers, the ones who suffered when Harrington dammed the creek? If they stood with us, most of them are too afraid," Daniel interrupted gently. "Harrington has broken them down over years, and those who might stand against him aren't organized." "Then we'll organize them," Madeline said, a plan beginning to form in her mind. "If they understood that I'm offering a fair, alternative guaranteed water access for everyone, protected by legal contracts, they might find their courage." Daniel studied her with new respect. "It's risky. Harrington has the sheriff in his pocket, and he won't hesitate to use violence." "I won't be bullied out of what's rightfully mine," Madeline said firmly. "And I won't allow Harrington to continue hurting people with impunity. There must be someone in authority who isn't under his control." "The circuit judge," Daniel said after a moment's thought. "Judge Hollister. He comes through every 6 weeks or so. He's known for being fair and incorruptible. If we could get your case before him." "When is he due next? That's the problem. He was here just last week. It'll be at least a month before he returns." Madeline's shoulders slumped slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "Then we have a month to gather support and prepare our case." Daniel's expression was a mix of admiration and concern. "You're not what I expected, Madeline Lewis. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious under his intense gaze. "Good," he said without hesitation. "Definitely good." That night, as Madeline lay in Daniel's bed once again, despite her protests that she should take the pallet, she found her thoughts returning to the cowboy sleeping across the room. There was something compelling about him that went beyond his physical strength or his willingness to help her. It was in the way he spoke about justice, in the gentleness he showed despite his rough exterior, in the pain she sometimes glimpsed behind his eyes. She'd known him barely a day, yet already she felt connected to him in a way she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was simply gratitude for his rescue, or the shared danger they now faced. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something that made her heart race when their eyes met across the fire. Such thoughts were dangerous, Madeline warned herself. She had come to Texas with a clear purpose to sell her inheritance and return to St. Louis to build a new life. Developing feelings for a cowboy with a vendetta against the most powerful man in the county was not part of that plan. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, it was Daniel's face she saw, and the sound of his voice that echoed in her dreams. The next morning they loaded Daniel's pack horse with supplies for the line shack: food, bedding, lanterns, and tools. Daniel also packed his rifle and extra ammunition, a precaution that reminded Madeline of the very real danger they faced. Before they left, Daniel sat at his table and wrote several letters, which he sealed with wax. "Messages to some folks who might be willing to help us," he explained. "I'll drop them off with a friend in Val Verde who can deliver them discreetly." They rode first to a small homestead about 5 miles from Daniel's cabin, where they were greeted by an elderly man named Ezra Jenkins. After explaining a sanitized version of their situation, Daniel asked Ezra to deliver the letters. "Happy to help," Ezra said, tucking the letters into his vest pocket. "Never did care for Harrington and his bullying ways." From there, they took a circuitous route to Madeline's property, Daniel constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. By mid-afternoon, they reached the line shack, and Madeline immediately set to work cleaning while Daniel secured the perimeter and checked for any signs that someone had been there since their visit the previous day. "All clear," he reported, returning to find Madeline sweeping decades of dust from the floor. "No tracks except some deer and coyote." Working together, they transformed the line shack into a habitable space by evening. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, with fresh bedding on the cot, provisions stored neatly on shelves, and a fire burning cheerfully in the stone fireplace. "There's only one bed," Daniel observed as they finished their work. "I'll sleep outside." "Nonsense," Madeline countered. "It's too cold at night. We can alternate. One of us takes the bed, the other the floor by the fire, or I could take the floor every night. I'm the one imposing on you." Daniel's expression made it clear he found that suggestion unacceptable. "We'll alternate," he agreed reluctantly. "But you take the bed tonight." As darkness fell, they shared a simple meal by firelight. The small shack felt intimate with just the two of them, their knees occasionally brushing under the narrow table. Madeline was acutely aware of Daniel's presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the strength in his hands as he sliced bread, the way the firelight played across his features. "Tell me more about your plan," Daniel said as they ate. "How do you envision managing the water rights?" Grateful for the distraction from her inappropriate awareness of him, Madeline outlined her thoughts. "I would establish a water association. Each rancher would pay a fair annual fee based on their acreage and herd size. The fees would maintain the waterway and ensure it remains clear and flowing. Everyone would have equal access according to their needs, with provisions for drought years. Daniel looked impressed. "You've given this some thought." "I stayed awake thinking about it last night," Madeline admitted. "It seems the fairest solution. No one should control a resource as essential as water for their own profit or power." "Harrington won't see it that way." "No," she agreed. "But if enough of the other ranchers support the idea, he'll be outnumbered." "It's not about numbers with him," Daniel warned. "It's about power. He has guns, men willing to use them, and the law on his side." "The law should be on the side of justice," Madeline said firmly. Daniel's expression softened. "In a perfect world it would be." He reached across the table, his fingers briefly touching hers. "I admire your idealism, Madeline, but I worry it might get you killed." The contact, brief as it was, sent a jolt through Madeline that had nothing to do with fear. She drew her hand back, flustered by her reaction. "I'm not naive," she said, perhaps more sharply than intended. "I understand the risks. But I also understand that sometimes standing up for what's right requires courage." "Like your father's definition," Daniel said with a slight smile. "Judging something more important than fear." "Exactly." Madeline was touched that he had remembered her words. After dinner, Daniel insisted on taking the first watch outside while Madeline prepared for bed. The cot was narrow but comfortable enough with the additional blankets they had brought. Still, sleep eluded her as she listened to Daniel's footsteps circling the small shack, keeping guard. Eventually, he came back inside, moving quietly in the dim firelight. Madeline kept her eyes closed, not wanting him to know she was awake, watching through her lashes as he added wood to the fire and then spread his bedroll on the floor nearby. He removed his boots, gun belt, and outer shirt before lying down, his revolver placed within easy reach. In the firelight, she could see the scar on his left shoulder, a puckered reminder of the bullet he'd taken when he stood against Harrington before. Madeline's heart ached for what he had endured, for the friend he had lost, for the life he now lived in isolation because he had chosen to fight for what was right. In that moment, she made a silent promise to herself. Whatever happened with her land, she would see justice done for Daniel Keller. The next few days settled into a pattern. During daylight hours, they explored Madeline's property thoroughly, Daniel teaching her about the land, the wildlife, and the rhythm of ranch life. In the evenings, they would return to the line shack, share a meal, and talk by the fire. Madeline found herself looking forward to these conversations more than she cared to admit. Daniel was surprisingly well-read for a cowboy, and they discovered a shared love of literature. He had a small collection of dog-eared books in his saddlebags, Dickens, Twain, even some Shakespeare that they would sometimes read aloud to each other. On the fourth day, as they were riding along the northern boundary of the property, Daniel suddenly raised his hand, signaling for Madeline to stop. He cocked his head, listening intently, then gestured for her to follow him into a stand of trees. "Riders," he whispered, dismounting and helping her down. "At least 3 coming this way." They secured their horses deeper in the trees, then crept to the edge of the grove where they could observe without being seen. Sure enough, 3 men on horseback were approaching along the creek. Madeline recognized one immediately as Sheriff Moss, his black coat unmistakable even at a distance. The other 2 were strangers to her, but their manner marked them as hired guns. "They're tracking us," Daniel murmured, his body tense beside hers. "Must have found the line shack." Madeline's heart raced with fear, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What do? We wait. See what they're after. Could be they're just scouting, not looking for a confrontation yet." The three men rode directly to the spot where Daniel and Madeline had crossed the creek earlier. One dismounted and examined the ground, then pointed in the direction they had gone before heading into the trees. "They're following our trail," Madeline whispered, panic rising in her throat. Daniel's hand closed over hers, steadying her. "Easy," he breathed. "They won't find us if we stay quiet." The men searched the grove for nearly 20 minutes, but fortune was with Daniel and Madeline. The trackers followed an older set of deer tracks that led away from their hiding place, eventually giving up and returning to the creek. "This is getting us nowhere," they heard Sheriff Moss complain. "Keller knows this land too well. We could spend days out here and never find them." "Harrington won't be happy," one of the other men remarked. "Harrington can come out here himself if he's not happy," Moss retorted. "I've got better things to do than chase that troublemaker and the Lewis woman all over creation." They watched as the men rode back the way they had come, waiting in silence until they were well out of sight before speaking. "That was close," Madeline said, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Daniel nodded grimly. "Too close. They know we're staying at the line shack. It's not safe to go back there." "Where will we go?" Daniel thought for a moment. "There's a cave in the hills to the east." Used to be an old prospector's claim. Not comfortable, but it's well hidden and defensible. They retrieved their horses and set off immediately, taking a roundabout route that would be difficult to track. Daniel led them up into rocky terrain where they could travel without leaving obvious signs of their passage. The cave, when they reached it as dusk was falling, was indeed well hidden behind a stand of juniper trees. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for the horses, but opened into a surprisingly spacious interior. "Not exactly the Palmer House Hotel," Daniel said apologetically as they dismounted in the dim light. "It's perfect," Madeline assured him, though in truth the cave was cold, damp, and uninviting compared to the line shack. Daniel built a small fire near the entrance, positioning it so the smoke would disperse among the juniper branches outside and not be easily visible. By its light, they could see that the cave extended back about 30 feet, with a relatively flat floor and a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably. "We should rest here tonight," Daniel said, spreading their bedrolls side by side near the fire. "Tomorrow, I'll go back to the line shack and retrieve what supplies I can. We might need to stay here a while." "I should go with you," Madeline protested. "It's not fair for you to take all the risks." Daniel shook his head firmly. "It's too dangerous. If they've set a trap, I stand a better chance alone." They argued about it for some time, but in the end, Madeline had to concede that Daniel was right. He knew the land better, was more experienced in evading pursuit, and was simply better equipped to handle trouble if it came. That night, they slept side by side for warmth, the cave being considerably colder than the line shack had been. Despite the hard ground beneath her and the worry about what the morning would bring, Madeline slept soundly, comforted by Daniel's solid presence beside her. She awoke at dawn to find him already up, checking his revolver and preparing to leave. In the gray light filtering through the cave entrance, he looked every inch the hardened frontiersman capable, determined and dangerously attractive. "Be careful," she said as he prepared to mount his horse. Daniel turned back to her, his expression softening. "I will stay hidden no matter what if I'm not back by sunset." "You will be," Madeline interrupted, unwilling to consider the alternative. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, madam." He hesitated, then added, "Madeline, if something does happen, head north. There's a ranch about 20 miles from here, belongs to a man named Carson. Tell him I sent you, he'll help." Before she could respond, Daniel swung into the saddle and was gone, leaving Madeline alone with her thoughts and fears. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Madeline busied herself organizing their few remaining supplies, gathering dry wood for the fire, and exploring the extent of the cave. But her mind kept returning to Daniel, imagining all manner of terrible scenarios. By mid-afternoon, her anxiety had reached such a pitch that she decided to venture outside, if only to see if she could spot his return. The juniper grove provided good cover as she scanned the valley below, but there was no sign of movement. The sun was just touching the western horizon when Madeline heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. She retreated into the cave, heart pounding, hand on the small revolver Daniel had insisted she carry. The sounds grew closer, then stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the evening calls of birds. "Madeline," Daniel's voice came from just outside the cave entrance. Relief flooded through her as she rushed forward. "Daniel!" Thank God! He appeared in the entrance, leading his horse, which was laden with supplies. His face was grim, a bruise darkening his left cheek, but he was alive and whole. Without thinking, Madeline threw her arms around him in an impulsive embrace. Daniel stiffened momentarily in surprise, then his arms came around her, holding her close. For one breathless moment they stood locked together, her face pressed against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. Then, as suddenly as it had happened, they both seemed to realize the impropriety of their position and stepped apart, Madeline blushing furiously. "I was worried," she explained lamely. Daniel cleared his throat. "I ran into some trouble," he said, gesturing to his bruised face as he led his horse into the cave. "But I got what we needed." As they unpacked the supplies, food, ammunition, blankets, and even Madeline's satchel with the precious deed, Daniel explained what had happened. "The line shack was being watched, just as I suspected. 2 of Harrington's men. I managed to circle around and get the drop on them, but one got in a lucky punch before I subdued them." "Subdued?" Madeline asked, concerned about what that might entail. "Tied them up and left them where they'll be found tomorrow," Daniel clarified. "No permanent harm done, though they'll have headaches to match mine." Relief washed over Madeline again. Despite the danger they faced, despite his own grievances against Harrington, Daniel had chosen restraint over violence. It confirmed what she had already come to believe about his character. "I also got some news," Daniel continued as they prepared a meal from the supplies he'd retrieved. "Ezra delivered our messages. 3 of the smaller ranchers have agreed to meet with us day after tomorrow at Carson's place." "That's wonderful," Madeline exclaimed. Her plan to build a coalition was taking shape. Daniel's expression remained cautious. "It's a start, but we're still facing an uphill battle. Harrington has put out word that you're a fraud, that your deed is counterfeit, and that I've kidnapped you for ransom." Madeline gasped in outrage. "That's absurd. Surely no one believes such nonsense." "People believe what's convenient or what they fear is true," Daniel said with a shrug. "But the good news is that Judge Hollister is returning early. Seems there was some issue in El Paso that got resolved quicker than expected. He'll be in Val Verde in 4 days." Hope surged in Madeline's heart. If they could present their case to the judge, with the support of other ranchers and the legitimate deed to prove her ownership, they might have a chance at justice after all. As they ate their simple meal by firelight, making plans for the meeting with the ranchers, Madeline found herself studying Daniel's profile. The bruise on his cheek had darkened, and she could see that it pained him, though he tried not to show it. Without thinking, she reached out and gently touched the injured area. Daniel went still under her fingers, his eyes finding hers in the flickering light. "Does it hurt terribly?" she asked softly. "I've had worse," he replied, his voice equally quiet. Madeline should have withdrawn her hand then, but something held her in place, the warmth of his skin under her fingertips, the intensity of his gaze, the sudden awareness of how close they were sitting. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything you've done, for risking your life to help me." Daniel's hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his cheek. "You don't need to thank me, Madeline." "I want to," she insisted. "You could have left me to drown in that quicksand. You could have walked away from this fight. It's not your burden." "Maybe I'm tired of walking away," he said, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "Maybe some things are worth fighting for." The air between them seemed charged with unspoken feelings. Madeline knew she should pull away, maintain the proper distance between them, but her body refused to cooperate with what her mind knew was right. Daniel's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he gently removed her hand from his face, though he continued to hold it between them. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly trying to control. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Madeline nodded, both relieved and disappointed as he released her hand. They prepared their bedrolls in silence, the moment passing but not forgotten. That night, as they lay near the fire for warmth, not touching but close enough to feel each other's presence, Madeline stared into the darkness and admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny. She was falling in love with Daniel Keller. The realization should have frightened her. They had known each other less than a week. Their future was uncertain at best, deadly dangerous at worst. She had come to Texas to sell her land and return to St. Louis, not to lose her heart to a cowboy with a troubled past. Yet as she listened to Daniel's steady breathing beside her, Madeline felt not fear but a strange peace. Whatever happened in the days ahead, whatever challenges they faced, she knew with absolute certainty that meeting Daniel Keller had changed her life irrevocably. And despite all logic and propriety, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. The next day dawned clear and crisp. They ate a quick breakfast, then Daniel outlined their plan for the day. "We need to check the northern boundary of your property," he explained. "There's an old trail there that Harrington's men might use to approach Carson's ranch. I want to make sure we know all possible routes they could take." As they rode out from the cave, Madeline was struck anew by the beauty of the land. Morning sunlight gilded the tops of the cottonwoods along the creek, while mist rose from the water in ethereal wisps. In the distance, a herd of deer grazed peacefully, scattering at their approach. "I understand now why my father kept this land," she said as they paused on a rise overlooking the valley. "It's not just valuable, it's magnificent." Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon with practiced vigilance. "Texas has a way of getting under your skin. I've seen prettier places, I suppose, but none that felt more like where I was meant to be." "Do you ever think about leaving?" Madeline asked. "Going somewhere Harrington has no influence?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I've thought about it," he finally admitted. "After Joe was killed, after I was shot, it would have been the sensible thing to do. But you stayed. This is my home," he said simply. "I won't be run off my home by a tyrant like Harrington." They continued their ride, Daniel pointing out landmarks and teaching Madeline to read the signs of the land where water might be found in drought conditions, which grasses were best for cattle, how to tell if riders had passed recently. By mid-afternoon, they had completed their circuit of the northern boundary and were heading back toward the cave when Daniel suddenly raised his hand, signaling for silence. Madeline froze, her senses instantly alert. For a moment, she heard nothing out of the ordinary, just the whisper of wind through the grass, the distant call of a hawk. Then she caught at the soft nicker of a horse that wasn't theirs. Daniel dismounted in one fluid motion, gesturing for Madeline to do the same. They led their horses into a copse of trees, tethering them out of sight. "Stay here," Daniel whispered, drawing his revolver. I'll go see what we're dealing with. Be careful, Madeline urged, her heart pounding with fear for him. Daniel nodded once, then moved away through the trees with a stealth that spoke of years of experience in the wild. Madeline watched until he disappeared from view, then turned her attention to the horses, stroking their noses to keep them quiet. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The shadows lengthened as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Just when Madeline was considering going in search of Daniel, she heard a twig snap nearby. She whirled, reaching for her revolver, only to see Daniel approaching through the trees, his finger to his lips in a gesture for continued silence. When he reached her side, he leaned close to whisper in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. Harrington's men, 6 of them. They're heading toward Carson's ranch. Alarm shot through Madeline. Do you think they know about the meeting? Can't be sure, but it seems likely. Someone must have talked. Daniel's expression was grim. We need to warn Carson and the others. How? If we try to reach Carson's ranch, we might run straight into them. Daniel considered this, his brow furrowed in thought. There's another way. It's longer but less likely to be watched. We'll have to ride hard to get there before dark. Without further discussion, they mounted and set off, Daniel leading them along a faint game trail that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. They rode in tense silence, pushing their horses as much as was safe on the difficult path. The sun was setting by the time they crested a ridge and saw Carson's ranch spread out below them, a neat collection of buildings surrounded by corrals and grazing land, with a creek running nearby. Looks quiet, Daniel observed, studying the scene carefully. No sign of Harrington's men yet. They rode down to the ranch at a cautious pace, alert for any signs of an ambush. As they approached the main house, a tall man with graying hair and a weathered face stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "That's far enough," he called, raising the rifle to his shoulder. Daniel immediately reined in his horse, raising his hands to show he was no threat. "It's Daniel Keller, Carson, and Miss Lewis. We've come to warn you." Carson lowered his rifle slightly, peering at them in the fading light. "Keller, heard you were dead." "Not yet," Daniel replied with grim humor. "Though Harrington keeps trying, may we approach? What we have to say shouldn't be shouted across your yard." After a moment's hesitation, Carson nodded and lowered his rifle completely. "Come ahead, but I'm watching you." As they dismounted, Madeline could feel Carson's assessing gaze on her. She straightened her shoulders and met his look directly, refusing to be intimidated. "So you're Thomas Lewis's daughter," Carson said after Daniel had made the introductions. "Heard about your trouble with Harrington." "Half the county has." "Mr. Carson," Madeline said formally, "I appreciate you receiving us, especially under these circumstances. Daniel says you're a fair man and we need allies who value justice." Something in Carson's expression softened slightly at her words. "Come inside. We can talk there." The interior of the ranch house was comfortable but Spartan, clearly the home of a man who valued function over decoration. Carson led them to a large kitchen, where a young woman was preparing dinner. "My daughter, Sarah," Carson introduced her. "Sarah, this is Daniel Keller and Miss Lewis." Sarah Carson was perhaps 20, with her father's height and a pretty face currently registering surprise at their unexpected guests. "Pa, is everything all right?" she asked, her eyes lingering on Daniel's bruised face. "That's what we're about to find out," Carson replied. "Bring coffee for our guests, please." Once they were seated at the kitchen table with steaming cups before them, Daniel explained the situation. Harrington's men heading toward the ranch, likely aware of the planned meeting, and the danger this posed to Carson and the other ranchers who had agreed to help. Carson listened in grim silence, his weathered face revealing little of his thoughts. When Daniel finished, He leaned back in his chair, considering. 3 of my neighbors are due here tomorrow, he finally said. Men who have suffered under Harrington's water control. They're taking a risk coming at all if Harrington's men are planning an ambush. The meeting needs to be moved, Madeline said decisively. Somewhere Harrington wouldn't think to look. My cave, Daniel suggested. It's defensible and Harrington doesn't know about it. Carson nodded slowly. Could work. I can get word to the others. But what then, Miss Lewis? What exactly are you proposing that's worth these men risking Harrington's wrath? Madeline outlined her plan for the Water Association, explaining how it would guarantee fair access for all ranchers and prevent anyone from monopolizing the resource in the future. When she finished, Carson was looking at her with new respect. That's a bold plan. Fair, too, if you're serious about it. I am entirely serious, Mr. Carson, Madeline assured him. My father believed in justice, and so do I. No one should control water for profit or power. And what do you get out of this arrangement? Carson asked bluntly. A fair return on my investment, the same as everyone else, Madeline replied without hesitation. And the knowledge that I'm honoring my father's memory by doing what's right. Carson studied her for a long moment, then glanced at Daniel. You believe in this plan, Keller? Daniel met his gaze steadily. I do. More importantly, I believe in her. Something passed between the two men, an understanding, perhaps, or a recognition of shared values. Then Carson nodded decisively. All right. You've got my support. I'll get word to the others about the change of location. He turned to his daughter. Sarah, fetch the map from my desk. Mr. Keller will need to show us exactly where this cave of his is located. As Sarah left the room, Carson's expression grew serious again. You should know, there's talk in town that the circuit judge is returning early. Harrington's likely heard this too. If he thinks you're planning to take your case to Judge Hollister, he'll be desperate to stop us, Daniel finished the thought. All the more reason to move quickly and stay hidden until we're ready to present our case. They spent the next hour planning. Carson would contact the other ranchers and arrange for them to meet at Daniel's cave the following evening. In the meantime, Daniel and Madeline would return there to prepare. You're welcome to stay here tonight, Carson offered as they concluded their discussion. Sarah can make up the spare room for Miss Lewis. Daniel shook his head. Thank you, but it's safer if we leave now while we still have some light, if Harrington's men are watching your ranch. I understand, Carson said, rising from the table. I'll see you tomorrow evening then. As they prepared to depart, Sarah Carson approached Madeline with a bundle of clothing. These might fit you better than men's clothes, she said softly. They're not fancy, but they're clean. Touched by the young woman's thoughtfulness, Madeline accepted the bundle gratefully. Thank you, Sarah. This is very kind. Sarah glanced at Daniel, who was deep in conversation with her father by the door. He's a good man, she said quietly. One of the best. Half the girls in the county were sweet on him before what happened with Harrington. Madeline felt an unexpected twinge of jealousy at the thought of other women admiring Daniel, then chided herself for the foolish reaction. He is a good man, she agreed. I owe him my life. Sarah smiled knowingly. It's more than gratitude I see in your eyes when you look at him, and more than concern in his when he looks at you. Before Madeline could formulate a response to this startlingly direct observation, Daniel called that it was time to leave. Blushing slightly, Madeline thanked Sarah again and hurried to join him. They rode away from Carson's ranch as dusk deepened into night, taking a different route than the one they had arrived by. The moon was rising, providing just enough light to navigate by. You trust Carson? Madeline asked as they rode side by side. Daniel considered the question. Yes, he finally said. He has no love for Harrington, and he's known for keeping his word. If he says he'll support us, he will. They continued in silence for a while, each lost in thought. Madeline found herself replaying Sarah's words in her mind. Was her growing attachment to Daniel so obvious that a stranger could see it after just one meeting? And more unsettling, was Sarah right about Daniel's feelings toward her? "Something troubling you?" Daniel asked, breaking into her thoughts. "Just thinking about tomorrow," Madeline replied, not quite ready to voice her true concerns. "There's so much at stake." Daniel reached across the space between them, briefly touching her hand on the reins. "We'll face it together," he said simply. The contact, brief as it was, sent warmth spreading through Madeline's body despite the cool night air. In that moment, she knew with certainty that whatever happened with her land, with Harrington, with the future, she wanted Daniel Keller to be part of it. The question was, did he want the same? When they reached the cave, it was fully dark. They cared for their horses by lantern light. Then Daniel built a small fire near the entrance while Madeline organized their supplies. "I'll take first watch," Daniel said as they finished a cold supper. "You should rest." Madeline wanted to protest, to insist that she could take a turn standing guard, but she knew her skills were no match for his in this situation. Instead, she nodded and retreated to her bedroll. Sleep eluded her, however. Her mind was too full of the day's events, of plans for tomorrow, and most of all, of the man sitting vigilant at the cave entrance, his profile outlined against the night sky. After an hour of restless tossing, Madeline rose and joined Daniel at the entrance, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the night chill. "Can't sleep?" he asked without turning. "Too many thoughts," she admitted, settling beside him on a flat rock. Daniel nodded in understanding. "Happens to me most nights." "What do you think about when you can't sleep?" Madeline asked, genuinely curious about the inner workings of this complex man. Daniel was silent for so long that Madeline thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft in the darkness. "I think about Joe sometimes, about whether I could have done more to save him." He paused. "I think about the kind of man I want to be versus the kind of man I've been." "And what kind of man is that?" Madeline prompted gently. Daniel turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "A man who stands for something, who doesn't back down from what's right even when it's hard, a man worthy of." He trailed off, looking away. "Worthy of what?" Madeline asked, her heart suddenly racing. "Of the future I want," he finished, his voice so low she barely heard him. "A future that seemed impossible until recently." Madeline's throat tightened with emotion. She reached out impulsively and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. "What changed?" she whispered, "to make it seem possible now?" Daniel's hand turned beneath hers, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they'd done this 100 times before. "You," he said simply, meeting her gaze directly. "You changed everything, Madeline." The world seemed to still around them, the night sounds fading as Madeline absorbed his words. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Daniel," she began, not certain what she wanted to say, only knowing she needed to respond to his admission. Before she could continue, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond the cave entrance. Instantly, Daniel was on alert, his hand going to his revolver as he pushed Madeline behind him. "Get back inside," he whispered urgently. "Now." Madeline retreated into the cave, her moment of connection with Daniel broken by the potential threat. She watched anxiously as he crouched by the entrance, gun drawn, listening intently. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then Daniel relaxed slightly, holstering his weapon. "Just a deer, I think," he said, turning back to her. "But we should be more cautious. The fire's too visible from outside." He extinguished the small fire, plunging the cave into darkness relieved only by the faint moonlight filtering through the entrance. The moment of intimacy they had shared was gone, lost in the practicalities of their dangerous situation. Madeline returned to her bedroll, disappointment warring with understanding. As she finally drifted towards sleep, she heard Daniel moving quietly around the cave, securing their position, always vigilant. Her last conscious thought was a prayer for his safety, and for the courage to tell him when the right moment came that he had changed everything for her too. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. They gathered additional firewood, secured the approaches to the cave, and discussed how best to present their case to the ranchers who would be arriving that evening. As the afternoon waned, Madeline changed into the clothes Sarah Carson had given her, a simple skirt and blouse that fit reasonably well, and made her feel more herself than Daniel's borrowed clothing had. When she emerged from the back of the cave where she had changed, Daniel's eyes widened slightly, his gaze taking in her transformed appearance. "You look," he began, then seemed at a loss for words. Madeline smoothed the skirt self-consciously. "I know it's not fashionable, but it's better than men's clothing." "You look beautiful," Daniel finished quietly, his eyes still on her. A warm blush crept up Madeline's neck at the simple compliment. "Thank you," she murmured, unused to such direct admiration. Before either of them could say more, the sound of approaching horses alerted them to the arrival of their first guests. Daniel moved to the cave entrance, hand on his revolver, until he confirmed it was Carson and two other men. "Mr. Keller," Carson greeted him as they dismounted. "Miss Lewis. Allow me to introduce Mr. Jacobson and Mr. Freeman, my neighbors." Handshakes were exchanged, and the men were invited into the cave where Daniel had prepared additional seating using fallen logs and flat rocks. A small fire provided light and warmth as the afternoon sun began to set. Over the next hour, 3 more ranchers arrived, each escorted by Carson's ranch hands who knew the location of the cave. Each man had a similar story: land that had once been productive reduced to struggling pasture because Harrington controlled the water flow. Each had faced intimidation, threats, and in some cases violence when they protested. As the last of the sunlight faded from the sky outside, Madeline rose to address the assembled men. Despite her nerves, her voice was clear and confident as she outlined her plan for the Water Association. "Gentlemen, I understand your skepticism. I am a newcomer to your community, and a woman at that. But the deed to the Cottonwood Creek property is legally mine, and with it comes a responsibility I take seriously." She went on to explain the structure of the association, how each rancher would have a vote proportional to their land size, how fees would be determined fairly, and how the water would be managed for the benefit of all, especially in drought years. "My father believed that justice and fairness should guide our actions," she concluded. "I can think of no better way to honor his memory than to ensure that a resource as vital as water is shared equitably among those who depend on it." When she finished speaking, the cave was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Then one of the ranchers, Freeman, a weathered man in his 50s, spoke up. "It's a fine idea, Miss Lewis, fair and sensible, but you're underestimating Harrington if you think he'll allow it. He doesn't share power, and he doesn't play by the rules the rest of us follow. That's why we need to present a united front," Daniel interjected, moving to stand beside Madeline. "Individually, Harrington can pick us off one by one. Together, with Judge Hollister's legal backing, we have a chance." "And if Harrington resorts to violence," Jacobson asked, "he has men on his payroll who kill without question. Then we defend ourselves," Carson said firmly. "I've been pushed by Harrington for years, watched my cattle die of thirst while his herds flourish. I'm done backing down." A murmur of agreement ran through the group. These were men who had reached their breaking point, men who had seen their livelihoods threatened by one man's greed. "The judge arrives tomorrow," Daniel reminded them. "If we can present our case to him with evidence of Harrington's tactics and Miss Lewis's legitimate deed, we have a legal path forward." Discussion continued for another hour, hammering out details of how they would approach Judge Hollister and what evidence each man could provide of Harrington's illegal actions. By the time they finished, a plan had taken shape. Carson and two others would ride into Val Verde early the next morning to meet the stage carrying Judge Hollister. They would request an immediate hearing, citing urgent legal matters involving multiple ranchers. The others would follow later, taking different routes to avoid attracting attention. "And Miss Lewis?" one of the men asked. "Harrington's men will be watching for her especially." "I'll escort her," Daniel said without hesitation. "We'll take the Ridge Trail. It's longer but less likely to be watched." As the meeting broke up and the ranchers prepared to leave, Madeline felt a surge of hope. For the first time since arriving in Texas, she had allies, men willing to stand against Harrington's tyranny. Carson was the last to depart, lingering to speak privately with Daniel near the cave entrance. Madeline couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw Carson clasp Daniel's shoulder in what appeared to be a gesture of support before mounting his horse and riding away. "What did he say?" Madeline asked when Daniel returned to the fire. "He offered his men as protection if we need it," Daniel replied, adding wood to the diminishing flames. "And he said I was a fool if I let you go back to St. Louis." Madeline's breath caught in her throat. "What did you say to that?" Daniel met her gaze across the fire, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I said he was right." Time seemed to suspend as they looked at each other, the implications of his words hanging in the air between them. Madeline's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Daniel," she began, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Last night, before we were interrupted, you said I had changed everything for you. What did you mean?" Daniel stood and moved around the fire to sit beside her on the log she occupied. His proximity sent her pulse racing even faster. "I meant that before you came I was existing, not living," he said quietly. "Consumed by anger at Harrington, isolated by choice, just getting by day to day." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Then suddenly there you were, sinking in quicksand, refusing to give up even when it seemed hopeless." His hand found hers in the firelight, their fingers intertwining naturally. "You reminded me what it's like to fight for something positive, not just against something wrong. You made me remember what it's like to care about someone so much that my own safety seems secondary." Madeline's throat tightened with emotion at his words. "I've never met anyone like you," she whispered. "So brave, so principled. When you pulled me from that quicksand, you saved more than my life. You showed me what kind of person I want to be, someone who stands for what's right, no matter the cost." Daniel's free hand came up to touch her cheek, his fingers gentle against her skin. "Madeline," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I know it's too soon. We've known each other barely a week, but I need you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the future holds, my feelings for you are real and true." Propriety dictated that Madeline should demur, should remind him of the short time they'd known each other, should maintain a proper distance. But propriety seemed a distant concern compared to the truth in her heart. "I feel the same," she admitted, her voice steady despite the emotions welling within her. "It defies all logic, but I cannot deny it." Daniel's eyes, reflecting the firelight, held hers with an intensity that took her breath away. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward until their foreheads touched. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with restrained emotion. In answer, Madeline closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began tentative but quickly deepened as years of loneliness and days of growing affection found expression. Daniel's arms encircled her, drawing her closer as they shared a moment of connection that transcended their dangerous circumstances. In his embrace, Madeline found a sense of rightness, of belonging, that she had never experienced before. When they finally parted, both breathless, Daniel kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he promised, "we face it together." "Together," Madeline agreed, sealing the vow with another kiss. They sat by the fire late into the night, talking of their pasts, their hopes, the future they might build if fortune favored them. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they slept side by side, hands intertwined, finding in each other's presence the peace that had eluded them both for so long. Dawn arrived with a sense of anticipation and dread. Today, they would confront Harrington, would present their case to Judge Hollister, would either succeed in their quest for justice or face defeat that could cost them everything. They prepared in focused silence, checking weapons, securing the most important supplies in saddlebags, going over their plan one final time. Madeline wore Sarah Carson's clothes, with her hair neatly braided and pinned. The deed to her property was secure in an inner pocket of her blouse, close to her heart. Daniel watched her with undisguised admiration as she mounted her horse with growing confidence. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes conveying so much more than the simple question. Madeline nodded, her chin raised with determination. "Ready." They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, taking the high trail Daniel had mentioned. It wound through rocky terrain that would be difficult for pursuers to follow and offered clear views of the valleys below. For the first hour they rode without incident, making good time toward Val Verde. Then, as they rounded a bend in the trail, Daniel suddenly reined in his horse, signaling for Madeline to do the same. "Riders," he said quietly, pointing to a dust cloud in the distance. "At least 6, moving fast along the main road." "Harrington's men?" Madeline asked, her heart sinking. Daniel nodded grimly. "Likely. They're heading toward town, probably planning to intercept the judge before we can reach him." "What do we do?" Daniel studied the terrain, considering their options. "We can't outrun them to town on this trail, but there's a shortcut through Devil's Canyon that might give us a chance." Devil's Canyon. The name alone sounded ominous. It's narrow and dangerous in places, but passable if you're careful. "Most folks avoid it because there's been rock slides, but it'll cut an hour off our journey if we can navigate it safely." Madeline didn't hesitate. "Lead on." They altered course, descending from the ridge into a landscape increasingly dominated by towering rock formations. The trail narrowed until it was barely wide enough for the horses to pass single file, with sheer drops to one side and steep rock walls to the other. "Stay close," Daniel instructed, his voice tight with concentration. "Follow exactly where I go." Madeline complied, her hands steady on the reins despite the fear that clutched at her throat whenever she glanced at the precipitous drop beside them. They proceeded at an agonizingly slow pace, the horses picking their way carefully over loose shale and around fallen boulders. They were perhaps halfway through the canyon when disaster struck. A section of trail that appeared solid gave way beneath Madeline's horse. The mare let out a terrified whinny as her back legs slipped over the edge of the trail. "Madeline!" Daniel shouted, dismounting in one fluid motion and rushing to her aid. For one heart-stopping moment, Madeline thought both she and the horse would plummet to the canyon floor. But then Daniel was there, grabbing the mare's bridle with one hand and Madeline's arm with the other, hauling them both back to safety through sheer strength of will. "I've got you," he gasped, his face white with fear that matched her own. "I've got you." They stood trembling on the narrow trail, the horse between them quivering with fear as the dust settled around them. "Are you hurt?" Daniel demanded, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "No," Madeline managed, though her voice shook. "Just frightened." Daniel's relief was palpable. "We'll continue on foot for this section," he decided, taking both horses' reins. "It's safer." They proceeded with extreme caution, Daniel leading the way with the horses while Madeline followed, keeping close to the rock wall for security. The trail improved after another quarter-mile, widening enough that they could remount and continue at a better pace. When they finally emerged from Devil's Canyon, the sun was high overhead, indicating noon had passed. Val Verde lay just beyond the next ridge, its buildings visible in the distance. "We've made good time despite the delay," Daniel said, checking his pocket watch. "The stage isn't due until 2 o'clock. They paused to rest the horses and share a quick meal of jerky and hardtack from their saddlebags. Despite the simple fare, Madeline found she had little appetite. As the moment of confrontation drew nearer, anxiety gnawed at her stomach. "What if Judge Hollister won't hear us?" she asked, voicing one of her many fears. "What if Harrington has already influenced him somehow?" Daniel considered this. "Hollister has a reputation for integrity. If we can get to him, present our evidence clearly, I believe he'll give us a fair hearing." He reached across to squeeze her hand reassuringly. "And remember, we're not alone in this. Carson and the others will be there too." Madeline nodded, drawing strength from his confidence and the memory of the ranchers who had pledged their support. Together, they might indeed succeed where individually they would fail. They remounted and continued toward town, choosing a less direct approach that would bring them in from the east side, away from the main road where Harrington's men might be watching. Val Verde appeared quiet as they rode in, the afternoon heat having driven most residents indoors. They left their horses at a small livery stable on the outskirts of town, the owner giving Daniel a respectful nod of recognition. "Judgin' yet, Pete?" Daniel asked as they dismounted. "Stage is running late," Pete replied, eyeing Madeline curiously. "Word is it broke an axle about 10 miles out. Won't be in for another hour at least." Daniel exchanged a significant look with Madeline. The delay could work in their favor, giving Carson and the others more time to arrive. "Seen anything of Harrington's men today?" Daniel asked casually as he handed over payment for the horse's care. Pete's expression darkened. "All over town like ants at a picnic, sheriffs with them too, looking mighty nervous about something. Any idea where they're concentrated? Saloon, mostly. And the courthouse where the judge'll be heading." Daniel nodded his thanks, then led Madeline away from the livery toward the center of town. They kept to side streets, moving quickly but without drawing attention to themselves. "We should get to the courthouse first," Daniel said in a low voice. "Secure a position before Harrington realizes we're here." They were just turning onto Main Street when a familiar voice called out behind them. Well, if it isn't the troublemaker and the land thief." Daniel whirled, pushing Madeline behind him in one fluid motion as he faced the speaker. Sheriff Moss stood 20 paces away, flanked by 2 deputies, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. "Sheriff," Daniel acknowledged coldly. "We're here on legitimate business with Judge Hollister." "Are you now?" Moss smirked, taking a step forward. "That's interesting, because I have a warrant for your arrest, Keller. Kidnapping and extortion. As for Miss Lewis here, Mr. Harrington has filed a formal complaint that her deed is fraudulent." "That's absurd," Madeline exclaimed, stepping out from behind Daniel despite his protective arm. "The deed is perfectly legitimate, as Judge Hollister will confirm when he sees it." "Well now, that's for the court to decide," Moss replied with a predatory smile. "In the meantime, you're both coming with me." Daniel's hand moved imperceptibly toward his gun. "We'll wait for the judge, Sheriff. Whatever charges you've manufactured can be addressed in open court." Moss's eyes narrowed. "Don't be foolish, Keller. Even you can't outdraw three of us." The tension in the air was palpable as the two men faced off, neither willing to back down. Madeline's heart raced with fear, not for herself but for Daniel, knowing he would protect her at any cost. Just when it seemed violence was inevitable, the sound of multiple horses approaching drew everyone's attention. Carson rode into view, accompanied by 5 other ranchers, all armed and looking grimly determined. "Problem here, Sheriff?" Carson asked mildly, though his posture was anything but casual as he dismounted. Moss's confident smirk faltered slightly. "This doesn't concern you, Carson." "I think it does," Carson replied, stepping forward to stand beside Daniel and Madeline. "I believe Miss Lewis and Mr. Keller are here to see Judge Hollister, as are we." He gestured to the assembled ranchers who had formed a loose semicircle behind him. The sheriff's gaze darted from face to face, clearly reassessing the situation. He was outnumbered now, and these were respected landowners, not drifters he could intimidate or bully. "The judge isn't here yet," Moss said, his tone slightly less aggressive. "Stage is delayed." "Then we'll wait for him at the courthouse," Carson replied calmly. "All of us, together." Moss hesitated, clearly calculating his odds and finding them unfavorable. Finally, he stepped back, gesturing for his deputies to do the same. "Have it your way, Carson, but this isn't over." He fixed Daniel with a menacing glare. "Not by a long shot." As the sheriff retreated down the street, Daniel turned to Carson with genuine gratitude. "Your timing couldn't have been better." Carson nodded, his weathered face grim. "Figured Harrington would try something like this. That's why we all came in together." The group made their way to the courthouse, a modest but dignified building at the center of town. Inside, they found the main courtroom empty, though there were signs that preparations had been made for the judge's arrival, papers organized on the bench, lamps freshly filled with oil. "Now we wait," Jacobson said, settling into one of the benches. Wait they did for over an hour, the tension mounting with each passing minute. Through the windows, they could see more of Harrington's men gathering in the street outside, clearly aware of their presence. Finally, the distant sound of the stage's arrival broke the tense silence. Shortly thereafter, the courthouse doors opened, and a tall, distinguished man in a black frock coat entered, followed by a clerk carrying a large leather portfolio. Judge Hollister was in his 60s, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes, sharp and assessing, took in the assembled group with one comprehensive glance. "Gentlemen," he acknowledged, then, noting Madeline, added, "and lady, I understand you've been waiting for me." Carson stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor. We have an urgent matter requiring the court's attention." Hollister nodded, proceeding to the bench as if this impromptu hearing were entirely normal. "Proceed, Mr. Carson. What is this urgent matter?" Before Carson could respond, the doors burst open again and Franklin Harrington strode in, Sheriff Moss at his heels. Harrington was a large man in his 50s, expensively dressed, with the florid complexion of someone used to getting his way. "Judge Hollister," he boomed, ignoring the others, "I must insist on an immediate hearing regarding some criminals in your courtroom." The judge's expression remained impassive. "Mr. Harrington, I believe, you'll have your turn to speak. For now, I am hearing Mr. Carson's petition." Harrington's face darkened with anger, but he subsided, taking a seat at the front of the courtroom, his hostile gaze fixed on Daniel and Madeline. Over the next hour, Carson and the other ranchers presented their case, describing in detail Harrington's manipulation of water rights, his intimidation tactics, and the economic hardship his actions had caused throughout the county. Each man spoke clearly and directly, offering specific incidents and evidence. Then it was Madeline's turn. With Daniel at her side, she approached the bench, producing the deed to her property and explaining its provenance. She outlined her plan for the Water Association, emphasizing the fairness of the approach and the benefits to the entire community. "This deed was my father's," she concluded, "obtained legally and in good faith. I came to Texas intending to sell it, but now I see a greater purpose to ensure that no one man can control a resource as vital as water for his own gain." Throughout her testimony, Harrington had grown increasingly agitated, occasionally whispering forcefully to Sheriff Moss. When Judge Hollister finally turned to him, he rose with barely contained fury. "This is absurd," he declared. "These allegations are nothing but the complaints of incompetent ranchers who can't compete in a fair market. As for this woman," he gestured dismissively toward Madeline, "she is a fraud. That deed is counterfeit, and I have documentation to prove it." He produced a sheaf of papers from inside his coat, presenting them to the judge with confidence. Hollister examined them carefully, his expression giving nothing away. "These appear to be in order," he said finally, causing Madeline's heart to sink. However, he held up one document in particular. "This transfer of ownership is dated 1868, supposedly signed by one Jacob Thornton." "That's right," Harrington agreed smugly. "Thornton sold me that land fair and square." "Interesting," Hollister mused, "considering that Jacob Thornton died in 1865, as records in my own courthouse in El Paso confirm." He fixed Harrington with a steely gaze. "Would you care to explain how a dead man signed over property to you, Mr. Harrington?" The color drained from Harrington's face as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. "There must be some mistake," he blustered. "My lawyer handled the transaction. Your lawyer will be questioned," Hollister interrupted. "As will you, regarding what appears to be a clear case of fraud." He turned back to Madeline. "Your deed, Miss Lewis, appears entirely legitimate. The land is legally yours to do with as you see fit." Relief washed over Madeline in a dizzying wave. Beside her, Daniel's hand found hers, squeezing gently in shared triumph. "As for the water rights," the judge continued, "Miss Lewis's proposed association seems a fair and equitable solution to a problem that has clearly affected many in this community. I am inclined to grant it legal recognition, provided the details are properly documented. This is outrageous." Harrington exploded, his face now mottled with rage. "You can't—" "I can and I have," Hollister cut him off sharply. "Furthermore, based on the testimony I've heard today, I am ordering an investigation into numerous allegations of intimidation, property damage, and possible murder." At the word murder, Harrington's demeanor changed abruptly. He lunged toward the door, shoving past Sheriff Moss, who made a token effort to stop him but clearly had no intention of actually restraining his patron. "Stop him!" Carson shouted, but Harrington was already through the door, running toward where his horse was tethered outside. Daniel reacted instantly, sprinting after him with Madeline close behind. They emerged from the courthouse to see Harrington mounting his horse, panic evident in his jerky movements. Without hesitation, Daniel uncoiled his rope from where it hung at his side, swung it in one practiced motion, and sent it sailing toward Harrington. The loop settled perfectly around the man's torso, just as he was about to spur his horse into motion. With a powerful yank, Daniel pulled Harrington from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Before he could recover, Daniel was standing over him, the rope now binding Harrington's hands. "That's for Joe Fletcher," Daniel said quietly, hauling the larger man to his feet. "And for every other person you've hurt with your greed." By this time, Judge Hollister and the others had emerged from the courthouse. The judge surveyed the scene, then nodded to two men who had accompanied him on the stage. "Federal marshals," Madeline realized. "Take Mr. Harrington into custody," Hollister ordered. "He'll be transported to El Paso for trial." As the marshals led Harrington away, Sheriff Moss attempted to slip away unnoticed. Carson's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "Going somewhere, Sheriff?" Carson asked mildly. "I believe the judge might have some questions for you too." In the aftermath, as statements were taken and arrangements made for temporary leadership of the town until a new sheriff could be appointed, Daniel drew Madeline aside, away from the crowd that had gathered in the street. "It's over," he said, his eyes searching hers. "You did it. You stood up to Harrington and won." "We did it," Madeline corrected, her heart full of emotions too complex to name. "All of us together. But especially you, Daniel. Without you, I would have died in that quicksand. None of this would have been possible." Daniel's expression grew serious. "What happens now? With your land, with the association? With us?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility and hope. Madeline thought of St. Louis, of the life she had planned there, of the teaching position she had dreamed of. Then she thought of this wild, beautiful country that had somehow become home in just a week's time. Of the people who had stood with her today, who had shown such courage and integrity. Of Daniel, who had saved more than her life, who had saved her heart. "I'm staying," she said, the words feeling right as soon as they left her lips. "The association needs leadership, and I want to be part of building something meaningful here." Daniel's face lit with a joy that took her breath away. "And us?" he asked again, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Madeline rose on her tiptoes and kissed him, heedless of the townspeople who might see, caring only that he understand the depth of her feelings. "Us," she whispered against his lips, "is just beginning." 3 months later, on a perfect autumn day, Madeline stood on the porch of the small but comfortable house that had been built on her property near Cottonwood Creek. The Water Association was thriving, with 23 ranchers now participating. The dam Harrington had built had been dismantled, allowing the creek to flow freely once more, bringing life and prosperity back to the valley. She heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching and smiled, knowing without looking who it was. Daniel rode into view, returning from his morning rounds of the property. They now shared in more ways than one. He dismounted with fluid grace, securing his horse before climbing the porch steps to join her. Without a word, he drew her into his arms, his kiss a welcome home that never grew routine no matter how many times it was repeated. "Mrs. Keller," he murmured against her hair, using the title that still sent a thrill through her after 2 months of marriage. "Mr. Keller," she replied, smiling up at him. "How are the northern pastures looking?" "Green and promising," he said. "The new irrigation system is working better than I expected." They had been married in Judge Hollister's courtroom in El Paso, after Harrington's trial had concluded with a lengthy prison sentence. Carson had given Madeline away, with Sarah serving as her maid of honor. It had been a simple ceremony but meaningful, with those who had stood with them in their darkest hour now sharing in their joy. Life on the ranch was challenging but deeply satisfying. Madeline had discovered talents she never knew she possessed for organization, for innovation, for leadership. The Water Association had become a model for similar arrangements in neighboring counties, with Madeline often called upon to advise others on implementation. Daniel had found purpose in managing the ranch, and helping other small ranchers recover from years under Harrington's thumb. The haunted look that had once shadowed his eyes was gone, replaced by contentment and occasional flashes of mischief that Madeline adored. "I have news," she said now, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it this morning when he was in town." Daniel's eyes widened, then filled with such tender joy that Madeline's heart overflowed with love for this man who had pulled her from quicksand and into a life more fulfilling than any she could have imagined. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." Madeline nodded, tears of happiness blurring her vision. "Due in spring, just in time for the wildflowers." Daniel gathered her close, his strong arms gentle around her. "I love you, Madeline Keller," he said against her hair, "more than I have words to express." "And I love you," she replied, her cheek pressed to his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "My cowboy, my rescuer, my husband, my home." As the sun shone down on Cottonwood Creek Ranch, Madeline reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to Texas, into danger, and ultimately into the arms of a man who had shown her what true courage looked like. From the moment he had thrown his rope and pulled her from the quicksand's deadly embrace, their lives had been intertwined in ways neither could have foreseen. What had begun in desperate circumstance had blossomed into a love as vast and enduring as the Texas sky above them, a love that would sustain them through whatever challenges the future might bring, a love that would be their legacy to the child growing beneath Madeline's heart and to the community they had helped rebuild. Standing there in Daniel's embrace, Madeline knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She had come to Texas seeking to sell an inheritance and had found instead a purpose, a home, and a love worth more than all the land and water in the West. It was, she thought as Daniel's lips found hers once more, the most valuable inheritance